So, Diana, the US dollar has been the backbone of global financial system for decades, largely thanks to the petrodollar system, which is, tied oil trade to the dollar since the 1970s. Over the years, there have been plenty of talks about, the dollar losing its dominance, but none have really sort of materialized in a significant way. Now, with China pushing alternative payment system and the Gulf states recalibrating their relationship with China and the US, and also the US using financial sanctions as a more aggressive tool, it really does feel like something is different this time. And your report dives deep into those changes. And I'm just curious, what drew you to this topic?
Well, Lizzie, I've been analyzing China for more than 25 years, and I remember when I was based out in Hong Kong in 2009 and Beijing started to internationalize the RMB. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of talk at that time, but very little progress in any meaningful way during the 10 years that followed. Mm-hmm. Now, in 2019, the world looked very different. Mm-hmm. And I did a big report at that time looking comprehensively at how China's strategy to increase the global use of its currency had changed. Mm-hmm. And when I finished with that big report, I decided, oh my God, I must write another 200-page report. Right. But what drove me was I was thinking, China's doing all these things. They're, it's quite a broad topic that they're trying to make their currency used more. And there is one area where it could be extremely consequential, and that's the trade in oil that is priced in dollars, or paid for in dollars, and the oil revenues are recycled in dollar assets. So that's kind of the three pillars of the petrodollar system, and it's been the linchpin of dollar dominance. But also, if you look at the size of it, the dollar oil trade is 1/5 of the overall dollar global trade. Mm-hmm. So if there is a meaningful shift there, it can have an outsized impact on the role of the dollar. And as such, I thought, we need to dig deeper into that issue, especially because when you look at that triumvirate of, what the US is doing, what China is doing, what the Gulf is doing, a lot of the dynamics that used to underpin the old petrodollar system had changed.
Right. Fantastic. Your report really highlights China's efforts to reduce dollar dependency as both an economic imperative and as a potential hedge against sanctions. So I'm curious, to what extent do you think China's push for alternative payment system as primarily defensive, right, mitigating risks, versus offensive, right, actively reshaping global financial structures to erode U.S. influence?
It's both, Lizzie. Mm-hmm. It is borne out by a defensive imperative. Mm-hmm. China is very vulnerable in terms of its dollar dependence. More than half of its trade is still paid for. There's a difference between denominated and paid for. We may not get into the weeds during our discussion today, but let's stick with paid for in dollars on US-controlled system, the US correspondent banking system, together with the SWIFT managing system. So from a national security point of view, China feels exposed, and that became crystal clear and really took urgency post the invasion of Ukraine and the aggressive sanctions that the US used. But the economic side of the equation has bothered them over the years, and it's not a driving force. Really, it is a strategic security consideration, and the economic cost plays a lesser role. Right. But with the issue of the petrodollar, for China, two vulnerabilities combine. One is the dependence on the dollar-based system, but the other is the dependence on imported oil, which is also another critical vulnerability. That's why this is such a focal point and so interesting to look into. And I was surprised when I sort of looked around that no one had really connected all these issues together, and that's what I tried to do.
Fantastic. Another aspect of your report is sort of the tech change underpinning all those, geopolitical shifts. You talk about the mBridge platform, Digital Yuan. They sound like game changers, at least on paper, but adoption seems a totally different story. So what do you see as the biggest roadblocks that could, potentially, accelerate the uptake? Whether it's, tech or regulatory issues or, geopolitical hesitations. What are the roadblocks to adoption, and what could potentially, sort of speed up adoption?
So my conclusion from all the research I've done, not just in relation to this report, but over the years, certainly since 2017, when I started looking into the great decoupling. Right. And that was the key thesis of my research for however many years it is since then, right. Is that the world is bifurcating into two spheres of influence. We are no longer in a unipolar moment. And it's two spheres of influence and not multipolar because China and US are so far ahead in technology terms than anyone else, and technology is pervasive, so we can't have another pole. Mm-hmm. So the world must pick whether they want the US-based system or the China-based system. If you look at the issue from that perspective, then and also from the perspective that at the moment, in the run-up and the kind of intensification of this great power competition, no country, no multinational wants to pick a side, but they will have to. And so technology comes into it, and the systems come into it from the perspective of what system and technology and agreement is the US going to offer to its sphere of influence to attract as many countries as possible to it, versus what system and technology and everything else is China going to offer to it. So in some ways, the geopolitical considerations become critical. Right. The technical considerations are not, because we've seen that the progress mBridge has made, technically, it's not an issue. And a lot of the innovation in the blockchain or distributed ledger technology that's involved in global payments has been actually homegrown in China. So because China started much kind of with a blank slate in mobile payments, didn't have the antiquated all the infrastructure, it was able to leapfrog the US in mobile payments domestically. Then it led the fray in terms of developing central bank digital currencies, which are less important from the domestic perspective from their point of view, but are critical for making global payments much more efficient and cost-effective. And it's kind of a secret DeepSeek moment in a way, or there's a quiet revolution because, of course, there's a lot of focus on AI. I must say the global payment system has not necessarily garnered the same attention. Mm-hmm. But take the numbers, for example, in the US, these global payments annually account for 2.2% of GDP. That's the size of the inefficiency. It's ginormous that every taxpayer is paying for this. Now, using central bank digital currency for cross-border payments can halve the cost. Mm-hmm. And the efficiency, it's from taking 3 to 5 days to move money around through the various correspondent banks to literal seconds. There's also a very important point here, which is that because the payment and settlement and exchange rate is instantaneous conversion, of course, there are issues actually with the exchange rate side of things, but without getting too technical, then you get a situation where you don't have to keep very large reserves for the liquidity needs and the settlement needs. So it's not a question of whether the reserves will be allocated to yuan or to dollars. They will just per se be a lot less. The biggest challenge for the adoption for any of these systems, because the US can decide to sort of move in that direction as well and explore those advantages too, something they are not doing, which I think is a strategic mistake. It's the legal and compliance side of things. That actually, in my conversations with practitioners, that takes up 80% of the roadblocks than the technical side.
Fascinating. And let's talk about Gulf states. I think one really fascinating aspect of the report is the tightrope the Gulf states are walking, right? So take Saudi Arabia. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which is a case in point. It aligns closely with China's economic ambitions, but security concerns also tie those states to the US. So what would actually push them to start, say, using yuan more seriously for oil trade? Are there specific financial or political incentives that could tip the balance in one direction versus the other?
Yes, you're absolutely right. At the start of the petrodollar system, both the economics and the security of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia is the linchpin of OPEC and everything else. That's why really the focus is on that one country, but it's emblematic of the broader developments in the Gulf. Right. The economics now, originally they were with the US, but now the economics of oil are with China. The economics of the way Saudi Arabia sees its future are also with China, to an extent, because it's technology, so it's whoever is willing to work with Saudi Arabia to develop that side of its economy. And the security considerations are still with the US. China, while it is increasing its influence in the region, and certainly the Saudis perceive China as a much more trustworthy partner than the US maybe realizes, certainly from my conversations, and they were grateful for the Iran deal, etc., etc. Nonetheless, they do realize that the security is still firmly really with the US. Right. And then at that level, it becomes a geopolitical consideration, and Saudi Arabia is walking a tightrope of trying sort of one of those countries that is definitely trying to have their cake and eat it. But what is important is that they are creating alternative infrastructure to allow themselves the flexibility. So they are a part of mBridge. The UAE was at the start of the mBridge platform development. And when it comes to payment for oil on these platforms using yuan, there is most likely going to be a geopolitical decision taken at the very top. But when it comes down to the non-oil trade, and there is a lot of synergy between the economic models of Saudi Arabia and China. They're both top-down, led by state-owned enterprises that sort of find it comfortable to talk with each other, etc., etc. There's a range of synergies there, but at that level, anything to do with the non-oil trade, the cost efficiency of the system that is created now, this technological breakthrough that could really revolutionize global payments, will be a key. So a business consideration, an economic consideration will be a key consideration for the average corporate, if you see what I mean.
Right.
So the non-oil trade, which is a part of the objectives of Vision 2030, for that to increase its share, is going to probably be driven by the economic rationale more so than the geopolitical rationale. And at this point in time, I would say that my assessment is that there is not any immediate trigger that could cause a major realignment, but the fact that the infrastructure has been now created for this to be possible suggests strategic intent.
Right. Fascinating. Another really helpful aspect of your report is it sort of outlines several policy recommendations for U.S. policymakers, right? From modernizing U.S. dollar-based global trade infrastructures to strengthening relationship with the Gulf. But given how long those reforms tend to take, what do you see as the biggest gaps in the U.S. now? And what are the most effective short-term imperatives from the United States point of view to sustain the dollar's dominance?
From the very short-term point of view, and if we zero in on the petrodollar system rather than just the issue of the dollar use globally, it will be relationships with Saudi Arabia. And actually, commitment doesn't take longer to sort of deliver. If you see, we can argue. Maybe it does, if there are disagreements. But if you have to build out the infrastructure, it might take 3, 4 years, 10 years, depending on the type of infrastructure. But commitment and finding a common ground hopefully might come or easier. Of course, I can understand that having never been in the shoes of a policymaker, the story might look differently on the other side. But that is something quite immediate. But the issue with the use of distributed ledger technology to enable the transformation of global payments, given how far advanced research into this area is already, shouldn't also take that much longer. It's, that's not like building, at the moment the US has a real problem with power generation and transmission. If you want to build new power lines, etc., improve, that will take 10 years of investment. Given where we are, I think the recommendation to look in the use of central bank digital currencies, distributed ledger technology for basically modernizing an antiquated US dollar-based correspondent cross-border payment system is not it's not a problematic proposition from a timeline perspective. I think what is probably the most difficult recommendation to make in the current climate is, and I'm speaking as someone who is originally from Bulgaria, I live in London, I am neither Chinese nor American, keeping an independent sort of dispassionate analytical look at this, but also seeing the reaction outside of the US, is that there has to be more carrot than just stick from the US's point of view in terms of enticing existing allies, let alone unaligned nations, to join the US sphere of influence. And of course, one of the most compelling aspects is to double down on what is the US's existing advantages, which is the depth and breadth and sophistication of its financial system. Because in my research, while the payment for oil and the use of the oil revenues are the bits of the system that are likely to be impacted by these changes, the pricing of oil is actually firmly in the dollar domain. And that's because, of course, the market system, the free, transparent system with long-built trust and infrastructure, will be the trusted one and the best to give indications on produce the pricing signal. So doubling down on existing advantages is also not a particularly arduous or time-consuming task.
Fascinating. On to the future. You suggest that we are moving toward a more fragmented, sort of monetary architecture rather than an outright de-dollarization. But there are other possible scenarios. What are the key indicators or milestones you'll be watching in the next, say, 5 to 10 years to determine whether this shift is going to remain gradual or is it going to accelerate it into something more major, like a more fundamental restructuring of the global financial order?
Great question, Lizzie. And I try to look to the future. Of course, looking in the crystal ball is always a difficult exercise. But what you're trying to, the way I approach this and how I've been successful over the years in seeing these big changes is to determine what's the key driving force here. So the key driving force is US-China relations in all this. And that's what I will be watching very carefully in seeing how it will unfold at the very top level. Mm-hmm. The most likely scenario at present is a gradual de-dollarization of the oil trade and more broadly. Or more broadly in the sense of the trade of the Gulf states with the rest of the world. This report, I didn't look at the broad de-dollarization point. And what is, though, extremely worrying is that the scenario where a sudden shock leads to precipitate change is the second most likely scenario, rather than a faster adoption because of, X, Y, or Z. And the reason I see that as a more likely scenario is because we are in this context of great power competition, which in some ways makes the world very uncertain and unpredictable because you have this classical Kindleberger trap where the kind of existing hegemon can't fulfill its role fully or to the same extent as they did in the past, and the aspiring superpower is neither ready nor prepared to do so. So you create a vacuum in the global economy that leads to increased geopolitical risk, and I don't have to start listing the geopolitical conflicts that we have had on our hands in the last few years. So whether it's a geopolitical event, whether it is an economic event that China's economy collapses, for example, we have riots in the US and the social fabric disintegrates. None of these scenarios that 15 years ago seemed crazy now are as outlandish as they used to be. So the worry is, and depending on the type of shock, you could either have a sort of a swift change in the direction of the China system or a swift choice being made by everyone else to join China or stay with the US.
Right, fascinating. And you talk about those wildcard events in your paper, in your report that could potentially shake things up. And one scenario that particularly sort of concerns U.S. policymakers is Taiwan Strait crisis. If that happens, how would that sort of change things around? Are we going to see a more kind of more leaning toward China-led initiatives, or people gonna flee to the U.S. dollar for a safe haven? How should we actually think about those contingencies?
Well, this Taiwan conflict scenario is a key worry and one of those critical sort of shocks that can shake the system. And that's, we don't have to think to 2049 to worry about this scenario. We worry about this scenario right now. And it depends also what shape of conflict we get. Because obviously, if it is a full-scale military invasion of Taiwan, it will be a very different response from the US point of view. It will also put the rest of the world in a very different position and the choices they will have to make. It could be a scenario which is kind of, if you'd like, a soft, at the moment in the Taiwan Strait, China's approach has been ramping up gray zone pressure. And it's difficult to determine at what point does the gray zone pressure kind of cross a red line that can be considered either a military act or sufficiently aggressive to necessitate a response from the US. So depending on what scenarios unfold or sub-scenarios unfold in that case, I would say that actually in this subset, using the financial and economic weapon from a US point of view becomes much more likely. Obviously, in the full-out invasion, it's going to be one of the things, but it's probably going to be not the most important one. Whereas it's in the section of whether it's a quarantine or, China's been ramping up the use of its Coast Guard and the way it's going to, establish its presence. That in those scenarios, actually, the first probably one of the asymmetric responses that the US is likely to be using, I would have suspected, does involve particularly using the dollar or dollar-based system.
Fascinating. I mean, your report is very comprehensive, and we barely touched the surface of the report today. But what are some of the other key takeaways you want to highlight to our audience?
Well, we really sort of looked across, but one thing that also, in this research, which took me in many directions, I've always approached this type of work as trying to look at absolutely everything that's relevant, and often so much is relevant. There is the issue, not just about technology and distributed ledger technology revolutionizing global payments, but it's global trade full stop. The system of shipping and bills of ladling is so antiquated, and so many pieces of paper and time taken to do something that in the modern world can be done in seconds if it becomes digital. And a lot of the roadblocks in that space were really sort of business roadblocks, because various banks, large banks, financial institutions tried to digitize that part of trade and trade finance, because those documents are relevant for trade finance. And that hasn't sort of gone anywhere. Actually, a lot of those initiatives went bust. And this is where we need also either supranational, but in the bifurcating world, it becomes complicated. But certainly top-down state approach at creating the rules and regulations which will enable for a more wholesale improvement of efficiency in the way trade is done.
Fascinating, Diana. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. This is such a fascinating conversation, but as I said, the report has much more. So we definitely encourage our audience to take a look at the report and really break down those big shifts happening in today's global finance. I appreciate your insights and look forward to see how all of this unfolds in the coming years.
And me too, Lizzie. And I keep joking that if you don't read the whole 160 pages of it, you can always use it as a doorstop.
Yes, a doorstop. A good one. Well, thank you so much.